Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Ankara has launched an official protest. And on Tuesday, the foreign minister of Turkey also warned Damascus that it is playing with fire. Now, according to Ankara, it was crossing the Syrian border to reinforce some of its 12 military outposts in the province of Idlib, where under an agreement between Turkey, Russia and Iran in July 2017, it was obliged to de-escalate tensions in opposition-held territories, which are essentially Idlib province, western Aleppo and northern Hama provinces. And that was until the strike took place. What the Syrian regime has gained as a result of this strike on the Turkish convoy, where 28 armed military vehicles were traveling towards a town called Khan al-Sheikhun, the Syrian regime has gained from this latest move its control over the town of Khan al-Sheikhun from thousands of rebel fighters who retreated after being surrounded by regime forces. Now, this is something they have been wanting to do for a while because it connects them to Aleppo through a vital highway, the M5. So that's the political update. But here's what gets lost in the daily grind of news from conflict zones. You're going to see a picture on your screens just now. This is a picture back from 2016. And if you look at this picture, you will see a boy in an ambulance, and he is Omran Dankish. He's 5 years old in this picture, and along with his parents and two other siblings, he was plucked from the rubble after a Syrian airstrike. You can see that he appears very apparently shell-shocked, and he's covered in dust and blood. At the time, Omran survived, but his 10-year-old brother didn't. The doctors then weren't able to revive his brother's stopped heart. So that is back in 2016. Today, it's been 8 years since the conflict in Syria started, and the number of men, women and innocent children who have lost their lives to this brutal power grab is reaching thousands. I would like to introduce the guests who are joining us. We have a journalist, a reporter from a town close to the Syrian border from Turkey. Mr. Furkan is joining us, Mr. Furkan Yagmur. We also have with us Dr. Murat Aslan, security expert, joining us from Istanbul. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Furkan. If you could spell out for us at least your last trip within Syria, what you saw, what is the situation like amongst the civilians?
Well, I've just been on the ground in Syria, and I've seen firsthand the damage the war has done over the years. At the moment, there's extreme fighting happening in the south of Idlib, and that's having a huge impact on the civilians in the area. Enes Diab was a journalist and a white helmet worker. He was a friend of all of ours, and he was very recently killed in one of these airstrikes. It's estimated that more than 500 civilians have been killed due to airstrikes since April. A lot of hospitals are being targeted. The UN has set up an inquiry why hospitals are being targeted, but aid workers and people on the ground I've spoken to tell me that they feel the international community has turned a blind eye against them and what's happening. And what's even more interesting is that I've spoken to many people on the ground in Syria, civilians in Idlib and in other areas north of Syria. And they all seem to have the same idea. They all believe that if the regime were to take over Idlib and succeed in their offensive, that they would kill everybody who lives there, civilians or not, doesn't matter to the regime. That's what people seem to believe. And it seems kind of true when you look at what the regime and regime-backed Russia is doing, because they seem to be hitting anything that's moving on the ground.
So the fear among civilians, you're saying from your interviews with them, is against the regime and what kind of action they would take against the civilians. Now, last year as well, Idlib province saw a lot of attacks, a lot of airstrikes from the regime. And again, in the past few months, like you mentioned, with the escalation of tensions, not just between Damascus and Ankara, but also Russia, who backs the Syrian regime. Now, can you tell us how the situation might be different, especially after the regime has taken over this crucial town?
Well, the situation, I believe now the regime are going to push even harder into Idlib, which means the situation for the people on the ground, the civilians on the ground, are going to get much worse. Now, most of civilians living in the south of Idlib have fled up north, and basically they're stranded, they're stuck there in the Turkish border. They're living under olive trees in tents. They have the most basic needs they can get and nothing more. And the situation is just keeps getting much and much worse for the civilians there as the regime pushes forward and forward.
Could you explain to us the kind of demographic you're coming across, the kind of people that you're seeing, the civilians? Are these people who are employed anywhere, who had been employed with the government or in the private sector? Are they educated? Give us an idea of who these people are.
These people are, well, first of all, these people are, most of them are not even from Idlib. They're internally displaced people. Some of them have been displaced up to 5 times, and this is the last place they've reached. That's Idlib. There's absolutely nowhere else left for them to go. And in the sense of what type of people they're all people who had, ordinary lives before the war. And, there's more than adults, there's so many kids, because obviously the war's been going on for so long that so many of the adults are still around. But it's mostly young children, and they have nothing to live on, basically. They're living, like I've said, under olive trees or inside of tents. They can barely have access to basic needs.
Right. And we've seen various reports coming out in the past 5 days, some giving a number as high as 124,000 have fled this area. You mentioned they are right now trapped at the border, unable to cross over to Turkey, which already hosts, I believe, more than 3.5 million refugees from Syria. What is the situation like for them? Where are they getting food and water supplies, any medical aid, any kind of assistance from the international community?
Well, to be honest, the international community is condemning everything that's going on. But what the people are telling us is, the international community has turned a blind eye to them. There are a couple of Turkish NGOs in the area that are providing, basic food and water for them. But as you've said, there's over 3 million civilians there, so it's very hard to cater to them. And just since April, actually, 400,000 people have been displaced, towards the north of Idlib. And this area is only so big that it can, hold all of them.
Okay, so I'm going to bring you into this conversation. You heard Furkan giving a update, apprising us of the kind of humanitarian crisis unfolding here. This year is going to mark 8 years into this conflict. Dr. Murat, tell us a little about Turkey's position here. Are tensions headed in a worse direction between Damascus and Ankara after the latest airstrike on the Turkish convoy?
Well, Turkish position is very clear. Turkey does want to prevent any humanitarian catastrophe in Idlib, because more than 3 million, and some people estimate that it's about 4 million, because there is no clear census over there, but many displaced person, and if once Assad regime enters to this region, first there will be refugee immigration to Turkey. Mm-hmm. And, Turkey has already fed up with the immigrants, because Turkey has almost 6 million people in Turkey, and almost spared, $40 billion. And only a limited amount of international assistance has reached to Turkey to deliver aid to refugees. Another issue, Turkey has already agreed with Russia and Iran to build a status quo in Idlib. And the interesting issue is that now Russia and Assad regime backed by Russia is just, disregarding this status quo and started attack to Idlib. And the difference with the current attack with the previous ones is that now we have Russian special forces on the ground. Russia has improved the capacity and capability of Assad regime, because they had no capacity to attack during night times, but now they attack including night hours, And the regular number of attacks last year was around, 30 to 60, but now they've surpassed it. Now we witness at least 100 or 150 attacks daily, directly targeting civilians at cities, towns, and villages. And the only aim for that is, I believe, to evacuate Idlib region from the civilians that Assad regime perceives them as a different sect, because Assad regime mostly trying to evacuate all the occupied regions that were declared as de-escalation zone. And this is the last de-escalation zone that all publics had filled up.
So Moscow's claim, Dr. Murad, when Moscow claims that the reason the convoy was attacked was because Turkey has, and in the past frequently so, reneged on this promise, this obligation to de-escalate, instead of disarming the militants, the rebels that they support, they have been arming them. Do you see any credibility in this statement? Why would they accuse Turkey of this then and claim the attack was for this reason?
No, Turkey has 10 observation posts in Idlib. And Turkey has to augment and equip these observation posts for self-help system, for self-security. Otherwise, these soldiers may be attacked by Assad regime. And as you know, Turkey has lost one soldier last month only because Assad regime attacked our observation post in Idlib. And the second issue, it's a clear thing that there's a status quo and presence of military, Turkish military over there is legitimate. But attack of Assad regime and Russia to the observation posts and Idlib is illegitimate because they have to cease fire. That was the latest agreement between three actors. And what I believe is that this is a clear message, not to Idlib, but to the summit in Istanbul that will be held in September to discuss what's going to be in Idlib. So this is a kind of preparation to push Turkey to accept something, and we will see what they will propose in September.
Okay, so Furkan, as this tussle between these three powers continues, the highest price are paid by civilians. And here we saw in the 7th meeting at the United Nations Security Council over Syria, the discussion of how many lives are lost and the issue of who was responsible behind the attacks on health facilities. Tell us a little about your working on the ground. Do you see the claims being proven there that health facilities, 90%, over 90% are being attacked by the Syrian regime?
Absolutely. The Syrian regime is especially targeting health facilities because I believe what the Syrian regime here is trying to do by hitting civilians is they want to scare these civilians into running away, leaving these areas. But like I've said before, there's really nowhere else left for these civilians to go. And the regime either is, the people on the ground seem to believe very much so, and it seems very true so, that the Assad regime, if they take over Idlib, they will not leave one of them alive because the Assad regime absolutely does not want anyone who's been in parts that were held by rebels or supported rebels in the country anymore. So by putting this sort of fear into them, they're trying to push them out. And Turkey, as Mr. Murad said, has taken over 4 million refugees, is at the moment not very capable of taking anymore, but there's still close to 4 million refugees stranded in Idlib in dire conditions, and the Assad regime doesn't seem to stop what they're doing. And the UN has set up an inquiry on why hospitals are being targeted, why workers are being targeted, but nothing's really come out of it, But the UN has also said that they're watching what's happening on the ground very carefully, and that if it continues, it will be an absolute humanitarian catastrophe.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Furkan. You're joining us from Şanlıurfa in Turkey, a town on the Syrian-Turkish border. Here, Dr. Murat, coming to you back on this issue of, is Turkey in a quagmire? Do you believe that it is on one side facing tensions with Russia and Syrian regime, and at the same time, things aren't really going that well with the US on their position in Syria?
Well, these two issues are different because Turkey and the US had made negotiations in Ankara last week, as you know, and decided on building a new status quo at the southern border of Turkey and agreed on building a safe zone. But the details are not released yet, but we do not know exactly what type of a safe zone is to be created over there.
But this is something that has been going on for a while. The US has continued to delay these talks. It almost seems like they have been buying time, not addressing the issue that concerns Turkey the most, and that is the presence of the Kurdish fighters on the northeastern side of Syria.
Okay. It's due to two reasons. The first one is that Trump administration or the US government always portray inconsistencies, because once Trump says something, we witness different act from the Department of Defense or Secretary of State. So Turkey has lost trust to the United States and does expect a concrete step in the way to solve the problems. Another issue, the second one, US support to PKK-PYD, because PKK-PYD has caused more than 40,000 lives in Turkey since 1984, and we know that the US supporting PKK by thousands of trucks loaded with ammunition and weapons.
Right.
So this is unacceptable for Turkey. But
and it still remains to be seen how far this will take this conversation into effect, bring it into action. Thank you so much, Dr. Murat, joining us there. Let me also welcome another guest who's just joining us, Mr. Piers Morgan. He's a researcher joining us from Berlin. Mr. Piers, according to various reports and also referring to the 7th UNSC meeting in Syria, the Physicians for Human Rights, an NGO which has been documenting the atrocities of war in Syria for the past 8 years, they've given these really alarming numbers to the UNSC. They have said that different data that they've corroborated says that 578 attacks on at least 350 separate medical facilities have been documented, in the killing of almost 900 medical personnel has taken place in these past 8 years. And more than 90%, they say, is the Syrian regime's fault. Give us an idea about how the UN, the UNSC and the international community is responding to this humanitarian crisis.
Well, first and foremost, I mean, one of the things we always have to keep in mind in conflicts and as things are occurring on the ground is that all wars are accompanied by very heavy levels of propaganda and misinformation. Now, certainly what we do know from the history of the war in Syria is that there's been sort of an organization of groups which have passed information up, which have essentially generated misinformation about what's going on the ground. And especially when you have a very heated situation, as you have at the moment, you have to treat all figures coming out with great caution. Now, I think, so with that
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I should also add here that the Director for Policy for Physicians of Human Rights categorically said that these are very conservative figures, that they were underestimating of what actually has happened. So clearly it seems like the situation is much worse than what she's been portraying in the UNSC meeting.
As I said, we know in the case of Syria that it's been accompanied by, as it were, propaganda operations by organizations which are funded and supported and which push a particular line. And there's no reason to think that's any different in this situation and the figures that are being quoted. So again, you just have to be extremely cautious about which figures you accept and you take. It's always important to try and step back and look at the bigger picture of what's going on here, what we do know. And what we do know is that there's a military situation in Idlib where the Syrian government is trying to retake territory from armed groups, some of them al-Qaeda linked, etc., who have been supported by external actors. And in that situation, that's a fairly sort of understandable situation for a government to try to regain territory if there are armed groups funded by external actors. It's very understandable for it to take military action. Military action is always accompanied with civilian deaths. All combatants should be pushed to adhere to international law, okay? But really the bigger picture here, and looking at it from a sort of legal international point of view, if you want to talk about the United Nations, you're looking at a large area of territory within Syria, which the Syrian government is trying to retake control of.
Retake control at the cost of hundreds and thousands being displaced in a population of 3 million, as reports are coming in. Again, this is going to be a long debate between you and me, whether it's credible information. 400,000 reportedly have been displaced. But let me just ask you this. What source of information in any conflict zone, if not from journalists or from humanitarian organizations, can one depend on then, if everything is questionable?
Well, you have to be very cautious about all information that you're getting, and as I just said, you need to try and sort of look at the bigger picture here and try and see which information is likely to be accurate. But you're never going to be able to say for sure as things are occurring.
In your opinion, which information is accurate then? In the Idlib offensive, where Syrian regime has taken back more land than it ever did since last year, are you trying to say that the collateral damage on the civilians is not as bad as a number of different organizations are reporting? Because the question really is the humanitarian crisis that's not stopping as a result of this power grab.
You're absolutely right. If we want to look at this from the point of view of the humanitarian crisis, and you're absolutely correct that people will be being killed in this process, but it still remains the case that if we look at the history of Syria and we look at the history of misinformation, that we cannot be sure that the figures that you're being given, which are being passed up to the UN, are accurate. Now, if we're concerned about the situation in Idlib and the situation in Syria, then we have to keep on going back to what is actually going on. And what is actually going on, and nobody disputes this, you have multiple external actors who have been trying to overthrow the Syrian government for many years, who have poured resources into supporting groups. No one disputes that. That's not questioned by anybody. And in a situation where you have external actors arming extremist groups, okay, then this is what will occur. And if the UN and if international actors are serious about ending the conflict, they need to stop the actors who are fueling the conflict.
They have to stop the actors who are fueling the conflict. It puts a good question out there whether the UNSC, all those meetings on Syria, is ever going to take shape into making a move on the US, on Turkey, on all the other regional actors involved in this conflict in Russia. With that, we've unfortunately come to the end of that part of the show where we have to take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be back with more stories. Welcome back. I'm Ayza Omar and you're watching Newswire. Now, in this part of the show, we'll be discussing escalating tensions between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. New Delhi's latest move doesn't help at all at this juncture. By releasing a huge quantity of floodwater without prior notification, which is usually the accepted practice between the two countries, into rivers entering Pakistan from India, the BJP-led government has essentially put thousands of people living in River Sutlej area in Pakistan under threat. Now, reportedly, some 0.2 million cusecs of floodwater, which was released from the Indian side, has flooded and destroyed crops already in large areas around Kasur, a city in eastern Punjab province, forcing thousands to be evacuated from their homes. The Provincial Disaster Management Authority of Punjab has also issued a warning about possible floods in River Sutlej and Ravi as the level of water at key barrages is continuously rising. To apprise us of the situation, let's talk to Mr. Ahmed Kamal, the chairman, Federal Flood Commission, Islamabad, right now in the Islamabad studios. Thank you for joining us here. Mr. Kamal, if you could give us an update on where is this situation right now in terms of possible flooding or existing flooding that has taken place as a result of India's move.
As a matter of fact, the flow that was released from the Indian side is yet to make its impact in Pakistan. On 19th August, through the Office of the Pakistan Commissioner for Indus Water, it was informed that about 159,000 cusecs of water has been released. At the moment, at Ganda Singhwala, which is the first point of entry in Pakistan on River Sutlej, we are experiencing 56,000 cusecs of water. And if it rose to 70,000 cusecs of water, then it will enter into the low flood stage. Let me share with the viewers that the gauge level at the moment at Ganda Singhwala is 19 feet. If it crosses 19.5 feet, then we will enter into low flood. If it passes 21.5 feet, we will enter into a medium flood. And if it crosses 23.5 feet, we will enter into high flood. That stage we are not expecting at the moment. However, with regard to the flood forecasting division, Lahore, tonight we may experience flood to the tune of 80,000 to 90,000 cusecs. That means low to medium flood at Ganda Singhwala, followed by on 24th, same level of flood or discharge of flood in Islam, Suleiman Ki headwork and followed by on 27th about 60 to 70,000 cusecs of water at Islam Headworks. As a matter of fact, these areas along the river are those which have been heavily preoccupied or encroached by the communities living on the river
Mr.
banks.
Kamal, I'm sorry, I'll have to interrupt you here. I'm just trying to get it here to break this down because it is technical information when we're talking about millions of cusecs of water. Give us an idea of what we are hearing from the 0.2 million cusecs of water being released by India, that having affected areas in Kasur, crops in Kasur, people are already being, as preemptive measures, being evacuated. Give us an idea of how big a volume of water this is.
56,000 cusecs of water, and the anticipation is 90,000 cusecs at the most during the next 24 hours, followed by another 80 to 90,000 cusecs. Let me share with you and with the viewers that the topography of the river Satluj is like that, since it remains without water for the entire year, and whenever their water comes from the Indian side, there is much hue and cry. There is no harm in saying that the encroachments on both sides of the river have put the communities themselves into danger, and for that very reason, the Provincial Disaster Management Authority and the relevant organizations have made it have ensured that they should be taken away from the riverbed so that little or no damage can happen to their lives as well as to their movable properties.
Okay, so let me also introduce this conversation, Mr. Shahid Malik, former High Commissioner to India, and Ambassador Shahid Malik, I should say. Welcome to Newswire, and thank you for joining us here in the Lahore studios. This move that India has just made at such a critical juncture, the situation is so volatile after the revocation of Article 370. What do you make of this? Is this the usual how India plays out on the Indus Water Treaty on releasing water, or would you consider it an act of aggression?
Well, I'm not surprised at all the way that India has acted and is going to act. And when I say going to act, that is what worries me, that I hope that all the concerned departments and agencies of the government of Pakistan are in close coordination with each other. As the Chairman Flood Commission just now said, along with him, the NDMA should also come on board and monitor the situation. This is a sort of an environmental warfare that India has unleashed on Pakistan. And I had been, warning people, of course, everybody knows about it, that this is going to be played up by India in a big way, and we should not lower our guard at all. What has happened since the 5th of this month and onwards, so this is an ongoing thing to pressurize us. But obviously, we are not going to succumb to these pressures.
And these moves that India continues to make, today it's releasing floodwaters. I mean, 19th of August, they announced. They've not yet reached most of eastern Punjab from the river Satluj or surrounding areas, but already 90% of the villages near the Kasur area have been evacuated. Now, this is a huge humanitarian cost to not only those living there near the river Satluj, but also economic cost. And it doesn't bode well for the tensions that are building up. How do you see Pakistan handling this?
Coming to your last question first. Personally, that is my own feeling. I'm quite disappointed in the response of the international community, not only on this issue, but on a host of other issues which confront Pakistan and where we have a legitimate ground to take up the cause with other countries, primarily with India. So I don't expect much support beyond lip service, allow me to say that, from friends, traditional friends, who have sided with us. I would be pleasantly surprised if countries come to our assistance or try and drive some sense into the Indian government that the measures that they are adopting are certainly not in order. As everybody knows, that there is the Indus Water Treaty between Pakistan and India signed in 1960. In my view, for a long, long time, that was the only treaty which stood the test of time between the two countries. And there is a provision within the treaty of the Indus Water Commissioners on both sides. Our commissioner, a very able person even today, they are in regular touch with the Indian side. But regrettably, the Indian Indus Water Commission has not responded to the already agreed areas under which certain inspection tours are allowed between the two sides. There is a mechanism under which advance information is given before the spillways are opened. That was also not given by India, with the result that we were caught by surprise. So I think we have to really see what are the remedies available to us. Right. Going to the international community, yes, as you very rightly said, is one way of doing it, but it is not taking us far. So we have to, in the context of the treaty, the World Bank is a guarantor. And the World Bank can be asked to look into it because that is an avenue available to us. Right. Because the World Bank has guaranteed this treaty. Right. And no country can walk out of the treaty or abrogate the treaty under Article 12. Both signatory countries, that is Pakistan and India, they have to agree to a sort of a new formulation. So there were some reports that India might consider abrogating the treaty. I think that is completely illegal and out of the question.
It's interestingly, let me bring you back in this conversation, Mr. Kamal. Considering the kind of the update you've given us that the water is not just yet reached us fully from that release from the Indian side of the border, but tell us if the situation would have been different in terms of handling this excess flood water if there had been given a due notification.
I think that that process is something which we usually do before the monsoon season every year. But this year there was no such arrangements made with India because of the ongoing situation. However, since 1999, this sort of a process prevails. But I think that the sort of arrangements that we have made are good enough. Both federal and provincial departments, including NDMA, provincial disaster management authorities, and for that sake, all of the departments are fully on board. The situation will not be out of control, and no damage hopefully will be there on ground.
Okay, but just to clarify to our viewers, because from where news reports and speaking to our peers reporting on this, we have an understanding that in fact 18 villages in Kasur are already underwater. Is this not the result of India's floodwater release?
Let me share with you that, look, this is at the moment a normal flow of water. However, the low-lying areas ultimately are going to get flooded, and those villages we are talking about are in the river plain or in the lower portion of the river. However, this inundation is going to further, you can say, spread on both sides of the river as the discharge increases, and probably at a discharge equivalent to 80,000 or more, the number will be much more as compared to the present number of villages.
Okay, now here I'd also like to welcome Mr. Syed Mohammad Mehr Ali Shah from the Pakistan Commissioner, in fact, for Indus Waters, Islamabad. Thank you for taking out the time and speaking to us. Mr. Shah, trying to understand here whether this was India's act of aggression, or as Mr. Kamal says it from the Federal Flood Commission in Islamabad, that this is pretty much normal except for the fact that they did not report it this time round, considering the escalation going on between the two countries. What is your take on this release of floodwaters that India announced on 19th of August?
Yeah, so as the Chairman Flood Commission has rightly mentioned, this is basically a specific hydrological condition in which once the upstream reservoirs get filled with the water, then you cannot hold the excess water which is otherwise coming in the rivers. Therefore, should it be the case for the Pakistani reservoirs, like the case in point is Tarbela Reservoir, where we have achieved the maximum conservation level. So now the country or the operator of the reservoir is not in a position to hold back the water which is coming in its natural settings. Therefore, whatever is coming in the river from the catchments has to be released downstream. So I would say that according to the given conditions, the hydrological conditions, the water is coming downstream once so these reservoirs have been filled.
So tell us a little about the kind of precedent that the Indus Water Treaty holds here. What kind of sort of maneuvers do the authorities have to take to prevent any kind of loss of life or land or crop from this release of excess water? As you mentioned, a lot of our barrages, our dams are reaching maximum capacity. What would have been done in order to prevent this situation?
Well, the Article 4 and the paragraph 8 of Article 4 of the Indus Waters Treaty provides that each party agrees to communicate to the other party as far in advance as practicable any information it may have in regard to such extraordinary discharges of water from reservoirs and flood flows as may affect the other party.
So then, Mr. Shah, let me ask you this. What does it say in terms of, in case there is a violation, a deliberate violation of the clauses of the treaty, if the other party hasn't notified, then what action needs to be taken?
You see, basically, so Pakistan started receiving the data of extraordinary discharges under Article 4. But as a matter of fact, we basically took up with the Indian authorities to provide the advanced flood information under the arrangements or under the stipulation of 1989 Advanced Flood Information Agreement. So that was not, so that could not take place in the current year, despite Pakistan's repeated requests.
Why do you
to
think,
the Indian
Mr. Shah, it didn't take place?
You see, this is, I can share my view that it is under the prevailing hostile relation between the two countries, on which we conveyed our concern to the Indian Commissioner, and so we got a response that according to the Indus Waters Treaty, India is obliged to provide the flood information in advance concerning the extraordinary flood discharges.
Right.
So if we simply talk about the receipt of the extraordinary flood discharges, yes, we are in receipt since 19th August, and we have been communicating it to the Flood Forecasting Division and the other stakeholders.
After several requests, you're saying, which were not immediately adhered to. Okay, so stay with us, Mr. Shah. Tell me what your expert opinion says. You have been the High Commissioner to India. You've been in situations where tensions between these neighborly states have, not always been perfect. In fact, they've barely ever been perfect. What kind of move does the Universal Council, the guarantors to the Indus Water Treaty, what can they do at this point so to, balance out the situation?
You see, as Mr. Mehr Shah has very rightly pointed out, there is the 1989 agreement under which advance information is required to be provided by both countries to each other in case of, the release of water. Now, this is a clear violation of the stipulated agreement, which I just mentioned. What recourse do we have, or what can we do? I think we need to, as the Indus Water Commissioner has already indicated, that he is in touch with his counterpart in India. But the response, in my view, in my experience over the last so many years, having served in India and having dealt with the subject, the response has always been of a nature that they are not very forthcoming with the facts, with the details, and with the information. So what options do we have now in this context? Now, this is, in my view, a grave crisis. The water issue has to be taken seriously by the government and by the policymakers. And besides agitating the international community, I think we need to also get in touch with the guarantor of the treaty, which is the World Bank. We need to inform the World Bank that this is what we have been experiencing, and these are the effects which are already being experienced by, Kasur and other areas. So this is the right time for us to at least inform them,
right,
and ask them to intervene or to exercise their good offices in trying to convince India to at least share the information with our commissioner, or have the Indus Water Commissioner of India talk to our commissioner. The meetings have not taken place despite requests from Pakistan, which is all given under the treaty.
But you talk about the recourses and the way forward to get in touch with the guarantors, the World Bank here. But let's look at the picture from what has just happened, what has unfolded. Pakistan has continuously raised its voice over the atrocities taking place in Indian-occupied Kashmir with this complete communication blackout. The reports coming out are really disturbing. I mean, 4,000 Kashmiris have been detained, so much so that they can't even hold them there. They have to fly them out to various parts of India, and God knows where they go from there. More to that is the constant firing across the line of control, which India pretty much initiates. I mean, there are 6 Indian soldiers dead already. From Pakistani side, we just saw 2 days ago, a 7-year-old died. So what difference does it make who we go to internationally? Do you feel like there is an isolation happening here when it comes to the Kashmir issue? Because this is where this is all stemming from.
Well, I wouldn't call it isolation. I would call it apathy of the international community towards a grave humanitarian crisis, which one sees unfolding every day. And I think it is incumbent upon the international community. There have been some comments which have been made. Only recently, President Trump indicated that he spoke again to the Indian Prime Minister, and with a view to seeing whether the two countries can get to the negotiating table or talk to each other bilaterally. Even if it's bilateral, one doesn't mind that. But the problem is that India does not agree to a bilateral discussion. India does not agree to a third-party mediation. India does not honor its commitments under the international laws and the UN, etc., etc. So in this civilized days of, the world order, what is the other option available to us? I would not like to think of the fourth option, which is horrific.
Right, absolutely.
So in the absence of these 3 avenues, where do we go?
Where do we go?
We can only knock at the doors of our friends who have sufficient clout. And let me emphasize this point again, who have sufficient clout with India to try and drive some sense into New Delhi.
But do you think the US President Donald Trump, that conversation he just had a few days back with Prime Minister Modi and Imran Khan, and then later on to the press he spoke about this conversation, do you think that clout is finally being cashed in?
It depends how serious is the person who's making these calls.
Right. I mean, before this, we didn't see President Trump having any stake in Kashmir. And suddenly here, he's not only just willing to be a mediator.
I'm glad that you raised that point. Why is it suddenly that President Trump feels that there is something that needs to be done between India and Pakistan? Why is it that our Prime Minister was invited a month ago?
I'm sure you're going to tell us.
Because it's a question of vested interests. It's a question of US realizing that Pakistan has a role to play in Afghanistan, and therefore it wants to be,
So you're saying that now the US is finally waking up to realizing its vested interest. But here, since we're running out of time, I quickly want to come to you, Mr. Shah. Give us an idea about, as you heard the ambassador talk about, what kind of recourse is available to Pakistan in this current volatile situation.
Before I comment on the question, I would like to mention the very foundation of the Indus Waters Treaty as defined in its preamble. So that states that this treaty fixes and delimits the rights and obligations of each party, well, in a spirit of goodwill and friendship. Now,
well, that's gone out the window then.
Yeah. So the spirit of goodwill and friendship is basically the touchstone to implement the provisions of the treaty. And the bilateral relation between the two countries are quite evident.
Okay.
So which can be considered while examining at how good or bad this treaty is being implemented or can be implemented.
Okay.
And so
very quickly, Mr. Kamal in Islamabad, if I could get your comment on, especially in light of the situation that is about to unfold, considering our key barrages are hitting maximum capacity, what can you tell us to expect in the next few days?
I think that whatever the situation narrated through the forecast by the Pakistan Met Department, the situation will not be that much, abnormal. However, the flows in the vicinity of medium flows in the Chenab, in the Satluj River, up to Islam Headwork will be experienced, and by virtue of that, a fair amount of communities on both sides will be underwater. But at the same time, let me share, I'm repeating this thing, that all federal and provincial related departments have made all out efforts and all arrangements. I think that the most important thing is to avoid any loss of human life and any precious installations. I think that those will be taken care of.
Well, let's hope so. Certainly our prayers are with the federal and provincial departments taking care of this situation. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I just want to thank you, Mr. Ahmed Kamal, joining us from the Islamabad studios, Mr. Syed Mohammed Mehr Ali Shah, and of course, Ambassador Shahid Malik for taking out the time and speaking with us on this critical issue that continues to evolve. And we will bring you updates as we move further along. But from Newswire and myself, it's time for goodbye.